I didn't go back to teaching right away. I went around the country, and that book was very successful promoting it. And but I did go back in '99. I was still coaching cross country also. Then I retired in 2000. I wrote a textbook called Team Teaching Science. I know you're a former teacher, but this was how to teach science to a group of both children with learning disabilities and general ed students, that sort of thing. That book was spectacularly unsuccessful, primarily because I went through a publisher that just totally screwed up the whole distribution and everything. Then I always wanted to write a novel, so I wrote a novel called Hurtling to the Edge. The subtitle tells you more about it. It was called A Thriller Involving Physics, Religion, Drugs, and Sex. Your four basic food groups there. And so, but as time went on, I said, you know, I did all these interviews back in the 90s when I was promoting another book. I went around the country and interviewed all these people that lived during the Great Depression. And so I had all those saved in a big tub and brought our camps up on Lower Wilson Pond outside Greenville. And I broke them out into tapes actually worked. And that ended up with this book that I wrote called They Never Threw Anything Away. And a great title. And that book's been very successful, very successful. I did not, when I retired from teaching in 2011, I started going down to the Naval Academy once a month. We would have a luncheon with my classmates from the class of 65. And in starting to talk to these guys about their experiences, I said, literally said, holy shit, I had no idea. I was living in a vacuum. I was on a submarine. Our job was to chase Russians. So we would go out and get off the coast of Russia and try to, in our own way it was dangerous and everything. We hit bottom once. When I come to port, I was single and I was chasing women. I mean, and quite frankly, the war was an abstraction for me, total abstraction. And so I started listening to these stories and I started getting very guilty and saying, you know, I need to try to capture as many of these stories as possible before all these guys die. We're all 80. And so that was the genesis of this book. Now, I want to talk a little bit about two things on this. First of all, the title. The title is harsh, and the cover picture is harsh, intentionally so. Because what I'm trying to show in this book is that war is a very, very, very treacherous affair. There are no rules to speak of. You can see what's going on in the Ukraine right now between Russia and the Ukrainians. Each side, you know, accuses the other of atrocities, and they're probably both true. In Vietnam, we had people that did terrible things, and we had terrible things done to us. That's what happens in wars. There were two poets, a British guy named Wilfred Owen, and an American guy named Joyce Kilmer in World War I. Kilmer, before the war, he's the guy that wrote, you know, I Think I Shall Never See, Something as Beautiful as a Tree. He wrote some poems, basically one called Memorial Day, which tended to glorify war in the sense of serving your home country and protecting it. Mm-hmm. Wilfred Owen was a British poet, and he took the other approach because he was actually wrote his poems when he was in the trenches over there in World War I. Just terrible. If you've ever read anything about that, just terrible stuff. There was mud and water in these trenches. They had rats eating the dead bodies. It was just terrible. He wrote one basically trashing war and saying how terrible it was. Mm-hmm. I got this title, and I talk about that in the introduction of the book. I got the title from a German soldier that had been at the Battle of Stalingrad, and he had called it a filthy way to die. Mm-hmm. A couple of my classmates that I talk about in the book that were Marines really liked the title because they were, in their own words, filthy most of the time. Mm-hmm. The one fellow who was a Marine said, you know, it was not unusual for us to be out, not have a shower of any type for a month. Mm. They they didn't wear underwear. I don't know what your situation was, you know.
Mine was nothing like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't, I was on an air base for the whole year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, some of these stories that I hear are they didn't wear underwear because that way when their clothes got wet, as they inevitably did, their body heat would dry their clothes.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, they said it really was a filthy way to talk. Let me get my clicker and we'll go through some of these things here because I want to talk about it. I like, this is the picture that's on the cover, and I like to talk to people when you look at this. This is some Marines that were just south of the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. They were under artillery fire from the North Vietnamese Army at the time. There was also some mortars coming in. And my question is, when you look at this picture, what do you think is going through these fellas' minds? You can only see two of the faces clearly.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, to me, you know, what do you think is going through their minds? What do you think? You got any ideas? To me, the first question would be, particularly the second guy looks very frightened, is, am I going to be alive tomorrow? In other words, am I going to make it through the night?
The first guy looks like he's talking to God.
Yeah. I mean, you know, like, please help me.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. The crowd's down there and just in a difficult situation. And you can't control where artillery shells come in. They come in and explode, and you're either alive or you're not. It's the same thing when you're walking on in a minefield. You know, and I think they're probably saying, you know, why are we here? What is this? Who are these guys shooting at us? Why are we doing this? I mean, they knew who was shooting at them, but, you know, what is this all about? That sort of thing. A little bit about the geography of Vietnam. It's very unusual shape. It's like an S shape. And all, from the north to the south is over 1,000 miles. From north. But at its narrowest spot there, just north of the DMZ, it's like 30 miles wide. It's a very strange shaped thing. And it's surrounded by countries that are now countries, but were not countries for most of their existence. Namely, Laos and Cambodia were never countries. They were sort of created, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But and then it was their big worry. Vietnam was controlled by the Chinese pretty much up until the year 1000. And following 1000, they had off and on independence with China because they would have big battles with them. Mm-hmm. And the Viet people were mostly in the north. In the south, it was different name to the country that they had at the time. But reading about this, if you read, there was various warlords that would control the country for a while, then they'd get overthrown. There were actually two sisters that controlled most of the northern part of the country for a period of time. Mm. So it after 1000, up until the French came in. The French came in about 1857. And one of the Napoleons came in and actually landed troops at Da Nang, which is interesting because that's where we first landed troops, and when the Marines landed. Mm-hmm. But they had a series of emperors, and the primary city, the capital city, the imperial capital was in Hue, H-U-E. And Hue was a site of ferocious fighting during the Tet Offensive. I had the opportunity to go to Vietnam in 2016. My wife, who now has Alzheimer's, she didn't at the time, she was just barely beginning it. We traveled with a fellow that I read about in the book that had served over there as an advisor to the South Vietnamese Navy. Was shot 3 times. Anyway, we started in Hanoi. We were the tour group. And
what year did you go there?
2016.
Did you I had a brother. I have
Yeah.
a brother.
Yeah,
He was in Vietnam. He was in the Navy.
yeah,
He just recently went over there, and he found out he had a daughter after 50 years. She's 50 years old, and he didn't
yeah.
know it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and she lives in the United States and in Massachusetts, and so she wanted him to go over there, so he went. But he said she told him, "Be careful." Even now, and that was just a few months ago, because they don't like Americans supposedly.
Well, now see, I didn't find that at all.
Mm.
I
I
was
wondered what you
drinking with guys who had been Viet Cong.
Mm.
I was having beers up north with a guy that had been in the Vietnamese army who had actually gone the entire route of the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Mm.
I only ran into 2 people during the 3 weeks we were there that were unfriendly. These guys had been senior officers in the North Vietnamese Army.
Mhm.
I ran into them down near Hanoi, which is now called Ho Chi Minh City. But everywhere I went, everyone was very friendly. Even up in the highlands, the country geographically is interesting because all along, there's 2 main deltas. There's the Mekong Delta here. But there's also a delta up here, a very important delta called the Red River Delta.
Mm.
And with coming down, the water all coming down out of the mountains up there. But there's two deltas in the thing. Along the seacoast, it's flat and sandy. But then you get about 30 miles inland, and you get into very dense jungles. And it's very mountainous. The part on their western side is all very mountainous, except down in the Mekong Delta area. And the most of the people are Viet, but the people up in the mountains are Montagnards.
Mm.
But we went up there to one of the cities up in the mountains, and the place is covered now with greenhouses. And you'll never guess what the big crop is.
Opium.
No,
What?
no,
Marijuana.
no, it's not drugs. They make a lot of money out of this. Believe it or not, it's chrysanthemums.
Chrysanthemums. Oh.
Chrysanthemums.
Mm.
The guy I had dinner with took me on a tour of his hothouse. He had 20,000 small chrysanthemums, and he would raise them up until they got about that high, and then he would wholesale them to other growers. And here's why. The whole idea is to get these chrysanthemums about really tall, about this high, and they're all yellow.
Mm.
Because when Tet comes, which is their new year, everyone in Vietnam has a big pot of tall yellow chrysanthemums outside their door.
Mm.
And this guy had become fairly wealthy. I mean, it's a communist state, but they're tremendous farmers, really good,
Mm.
hardworking farmers. And I talked to some ladies up in the north that were growing lettuce. And I grew up on a farm in Kentucky, and I was so jealous of, oh my God, they had this beautiful field of beautiful lettuce plants. But anyway, to answer your question, I found the exact opposite. I actually sat on the street in Hanoi. They had a little lady set up an impromptu place where they had a big pot where she was boiling pho, P-H-O. It's pronounced 8 different ways.
Mm.
But pho is talking about this soup that they make. And they said, do you have any, my friend said, how can you eat on the street? I mean, eat this, because you got little stools you sit on. I said, well, it's boiling water, you know, and whatever is in it tastes good. So anyway, I
Yeah.
found it interesting. I encourage people to go and find out for themselves. It's
taught-
inexpensive.
Yeah, I taught with a man who was a conscientious objector during
Yes.
Vietnam,
Yeah.
and he went over and he worked with the farmers,
Yes.
and he went back over 10 years ago,
Uh-huh.
and he was treated like a king. I
Yeah.
mean, the people that he
Yeah.
worked with,
Yeah.
they're, right away introduced him to his children, and they took him all over the country, but he said the cities was totally different. He
Well,
said
see,
he
I-
wasn't welcome there.
It's interesting. I actually rode a motorcycle with our tour guide when we got to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, one of my buddies had been in the Army and never seen any action, but other than to work in a building inside. He was a lawyer, and he made out wills for people and stuff. And he wanted me to go find a building to see if it was still there. So my tour guide threw me on the back of his motorcycle, and we went flying across 45 minutes all the way across Saigon and everything, and the building was still there and everything. But I did not, even in the cities, I felt very welcome up in Hanoi. I was surprised. I was very surprised, particularly when they, I told them I had been in the U.S. Navy. So
Well, didn't they invited U.S. back diplomatically in the 80s, didn't they?
yes,
It wasn't.
And
It
the
wasn't
pre-
very long after the
we
war.
were
that-
just over. The president was just over
Yeah.
there. So I mean, it's an interesting country, very hard working.
What was the attraction for the French to want to colonize it or whatever?
Two things: rubber,
Okay.
and secondly, rice. The south part of Vietnam is amazing for growing rice, and they still grow it today. You can see a lot of rice fields there. But that was their two cash crops, and they after they invaded in 1857, they could control the country pretty easily because of the Catholics who were there, and the wealthy Catholics got co-opted by the French, and the French really didn't have to do much to control the population. Now, as it went on, and I'll talk about this in a minute, they started developing some communist resistance up in the north. And but I just want you to see the geography of it there. It's really important to understand that. The little line here, this is the DMZ. That's at roughly the 17th parallel. There's a river going there.
That dawn, or it looks like it's dawn, that's about our station right there.
Oh, really?
We'd go to the beach and.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Quignon, well, I call it Quignon. but
Yeah, Queen Anne.
That's
I think
about
that's
our
that's a
station.
pretty good pronunciation.
Yeah, for the
actually.
whole year,
That's a pretty good pronunciation.
yeah.
So here, weather war. Okay, I've already talked about this. Vietnamese, that's the name of the people in Nam is South. That's where the word comes from. And there is, you can see Ho Chi Minh's real name is Nguyen Ai Qua. There was actually a Nguyen dynasty. A lot of people in South or in Vietnam altogether are named Nguyen. But he was an interesting guy. He had like 100 aliases. And he was born in the north. He actually was very well educated. He went to Ho Chi Minh, and I got a picture of him coming. Now let's go over this. I'll talk about that. But basically, when World War II broke out, when France collapsed, the Vichy regime, which was controlled by the Germans, controlled all the colonies. So they allowed the Japanese to come in without any fight because they were partners. The Germans and Japanese were partners. And so the communists in the north started fighting the Japanese through guerrilla warfare, and I'll talk about that in a minute when I talk about Ho Chi Minh. Here he is right here. I would suggest that he's one of the most interesting characters of the 20th century. As I said, he was well educated. He spoke fluently 6 languages. He actually was a pastry chef in Boston.
I was going to say he was educated in the U.S.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well he was educated everywhere. I'll talk about it in a minute. I mean, he is a really interesting guy. He actually started the French Communist Party when he was in Paris around 1920. 1920, he tried to meet up with President Wilson when he came over for the post-war conferences there, and Wilson wouldn't see these guys, sort of thing. And I'll talk about that a little bit more because it's somewhat ironic that us, as having fought a colonial power and gained our independence, we chose as a nation to rebuff people trying to gain their independence and sided with the colonial power. But Ho Chi Minh he lived in the U.S., both in Harlem, in the Bronx. He lived in Boston for a while. He lived in Paris. He lived in Moscow. He spent quite a lot of time in China. And he actually married a Chinese woman. And they said to him, "Why did you marry a Chinese woman?" And he said, very matter-of-factly, "I wanted to learn Chinese." And then he divorced her 2 years later. He left her. I mean, but she had served her purpose, that sort of thing. So when he was talking to like Stalin and to Mao, he could talk to them in their language, and he had impeccable communist credentials from having begun all these parties. During the World War II, he was a guerrilla, and the U.S., through the OSS, which is the forerunner to the CIA, actually airdropped supplies and materials to Ho Chi Minh to fight the Japanese. Also, allegedly, he got malaria, and we had an Army doctor and an Army nurse treating him. That we parachuted into the jungles there to help, because we really wanted those guys to fight against the Japanese. When the war was over, I got that one slide there. The group that he called was called the Viet Minh, M-I-N-H. Okay, that was all the communists in the north part of the country. When the war ended, there was a temporary peace between the Viet Minh and the French. And then it ended in 46 when the French again bombarded Hanoi. And pretty much this was the start of what's called the Indochina War. That's what they call it, the Indochina War. That went from 46 up until Dien Bien Phu, when the French were defeated in 54, I believe it was. So you can read the slides. I'm not going to read it to you there. But the French were just brutal. I mean, they suffered a lot of losses. They lost more men in their war against the Vietnamese communists than we did. We lost 58,000. They lost it close to 100,000. And of course, the Vietnamese lost something like 300,000. But when you go to Hanoi, I wanted to go to, one of the places you go is the Hanoi Hilton to see where our POWs were kept. 3/4 of that museum has nothing to do with the U.S. war. That's what they call it, the U.S. war. It is all about the French war, the Indochina War, and these graphic exhibits of how the French were torturing prisoners and stuff like this, and but it is mostly about how bad the French were in that museum there right now. Let's go on. When the French, we actually were helping the French. We were even airdropping supplies at Dien Bien Phu, the critical battle in which the French were defeated, and they said, "We're out of here, we're leaving." In the book, I talk about, there's a section called Why the War, and I talk about this long telegram. Have you ever heard of this?
I read the book.
Oh, you read the book, okay, so you know then, yeah. But I talk about the long telegram. And this was interesting because it was a 5,300 word telegram from he was not the ambassador, from a diplomat that we had who spoke fluent Russian, that he cabled back to the U.S. State Department saying his impression of how to combat Russia, the Soviet Union. And he said, basically, not in the exact words, but we need to establish a policy of containment. This cable became very famous within the State Department and the Defense Department and all the leadership of the United States. And in 1950, the National Security Council document number 68 formalized it as a policy basically of containment and established the domino theory. That if one of these countries falls, then another one's going to fall, then another one's going to fall, and pretty soon the whole world's going to be communist. That's what this was. And this was bipartisan in the sense that this was pretty much the doctrine of the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, and the Johnson administration.
Mm.
That was it.
Mm.
And ironically, this guy right here, Nitze, handed me my diploma, along with, he was Secretary of the Navy,
Mm-hmm.
along with 9 of my classmates who were killed. Basically, he handed them a death sentence.
Mm.
And I subsequently, in early 80s, 1981, met Nitze again. I was working in the Pentagon, and I was involved in arms control, and he was the ambassador, U.S. ambassador for the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, trying to control cruise missiles. And my job was to try to ensure that no Navy cruise missiles were ever contained in any arms control agreement. That's what my job was. So anyway, I went over and briefed Nitze, and I took along the picture of him handing me my diploma and said, hey, what goes around comes around.
Mm.
But yes. So anyway, interesting guy, one of the intellectual guy that was involved in it didn't matter whether it was Republican or Democrat administration. He's one of these guys that's always there behind the scenes. So that's the thing about the Van Few. The Geneva Accords. This is one of these things that where all the countries get together, kind of stop a war, like hopefully we'll be able to do this between Ukraine and Russia. And there'll be some division of spoils. In this case, the communists got everything north of the 17th parallel, and the South Vietnamese got everything south of there. And the idea was they would have a national election in 1956 to settle who was going to run the country. Well, neither side had any intention, particularly the South Vietnamese had no intention whatsoever of having this election, because they knew that 95 to 98% of the vote in the communist North would be for them, and they would have enough votes to overwhelm whatever they had in the South. So, but everyone went along with this fiction. So the U.S. and South Vietnam, neither one signed this thing. And you can see there what happened down south was they had a president named Bao, and he pointed, I'll show you the next slide. These two guys started running the show in the South. The North was getting ready for war. They were building the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which wasn't, when you say Ho Chi Minh Trail, it really wasn't a trail. It was a whole series of trails where some would go this way, that way, and whatever through the jungles, such that if you bombed one, they still had another route. But it was all collectively called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went all the way from the north all the way down to the delta. So they could bring in their troops, North Vietnamese regular troops, all the way down there. And we foolishly, because we respected, quote unquote, the independence of Laos and Cambodia when no one else did, until later in the war. But meanwhile, these guys were just pouring troops out. Diem was Catholic, and he hated Buddhists. Well, the problem was there are a lot of Buddhists, and it's the primary religion. And his, I don't know if you've ever read those two books. They're very interesting. They're novels, very famous novels. The Quiet American, his name I'm trying to remember right now, Graham Greene wrote that one, and the British guy Graham Greene, because he lived in Vietnam for a while.
We don't have those here, right?
I don't know offhand if we had them.
They're older books, but they're very interesting.
Yeah.
They're novels, but they let you understand the atmosphere of what was going on, because the country in the South was really being run by the CIA. And this guy Lansdale, who is the fictional character in both of these books, they were basically controlling these two guys. And these guys would, you may have seen this. Well, You could read that real quick. The third one is the one, May of '63. The Buddhists are having a big celebration once again up at Hue. Now, when I went to Hue on this too, there's still bullet holes in all the walls there from this tremendous battle that took place for the imperial capital. Anyway, this guy knew, who was Diem's brother, younger brother, was just a real vicious guy, and he went up and just really took it to the Buddhists. His wife, Diem was a bachelor, and so the younger brother's wife, Madame New, and I got her picture here in a second.
She was a sweetie.
Oh yeah, she was really something else. Look at her there. She called the guys that put themselves on fire like this. She referred to it as barbecues. Now that did not go well with the U.S. public. And
Well, I don't know how. I don't think the CIA controlled them so much as the CIA funneled money to them, and they basically did whatever they wanted in the country.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we controlled them in the sense of what's coming up here in just a second.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So anyway, that's a terrible picture. But there she is there talking to Johnson. And by November of '63, the Americans, namely President Kennedy, were fed up, and they basically said to the generals, take them out. So a group of generals, South Vietnamese generals, staged a coup. The two guys escaped. They made it one day until some lower ranking guys found them on the Chinese side, Kolan, of Saigon, and just shot them. Then guy, big man, took over for a while, and then this guy Key, and then Nguyen Tu. And Tu actually got into a fight with Key, and he left office, I think, in '71, and Tu was there until the North Vietnamese came down. That's some pictures there, him with Johnson.
Because I know, like, things were happening, like the CIA and the U.S. government was sending them tanks, and they were basically just selling the tanks to the Viet Cong,
Yeah.
So that they would have play money to do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
It was
Kennedy just like pulled protection basically, and it was a day, and
It was
they were gone.
totally corrupt
Yeah,
regime,
yeah.
and everyone knew it, and this is why there wasn't a whole lot of loyalty.
And it was basically the same thing as with Chiang Kai-shek in China, in that the U.S. picked a very corrupt
Right.
regime
One
that
of
was
the ladies,
unpopular with the people and just funneled money.
one
to
of the
them.
ladies, John, that I interviewed for my other book about the Great Depression, her apartment was filled with all these Chinese artifacts, and she had actually worked for the OSS/CIA in China prior to Mao beating Chiang Kai-shek. And she has incredibly harsh things to say about Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, and in saying that she was not a fan of Mao, but she said Chiang Kai-shek was just treated their own people terribly, terribly, sort of thing. I actually ran into a Chinese nationalist expatriate in Puerto Rico who was very wealthy and lived in I ended up in his high rise, and he had the most fabulous collection of Chinese artifacts there in San Juan, Puerto Rico, that they had spirited out of the country when the communists took over. Anyway, just an aside. Westmoreland, very controversial now in retrospect. His first few years there, he was an idol. He was Times Man of the Year. He came back to the Congress and said, hey, we're winning this thing. This was in the November of '67. And we're winning every battle. We're going to win this thing. You can see how the troop strength went up 16,000 up to 535,000. My class graduated in June of '65. We sent U.S. Marines ashore to Da Nang in April of '65. And when were you there? What years were you there?
69 and 70.
Okay, yeah. they're very interesting. If you look at, I don't have a slide for this showing here, but I'm going to probably put one in later. But if you look at the curve of the American fatalities, it's almost exactly a bell curve.
Mm.
And the highest casualties were in 68 and 69. But body count became the thing. So if you shot a water buffalo, that became part of your body count because that's how you get promoted. You shoot civilians, body count. God, that guy looks like he was a communist. So they were getting bad numbers coming up because they were promoting bad numbers. And that's why they were getting all this bum information. But they knew it was bum information. And still they'd come back and say, hey, everything's going great. Well, that all went literally up in smoke when the Tet Offensive came at the end of January of 68. Major battles in every city, major city in the South. As I say, almost all of them were repulsed. And the communists suffered incredible casualties. But it changed American public opinion unalterably, such that now everyone realized we weren't winning this war. This war could drag on forever. It's now a TV war where Walter Cronkite would have a clip every night on the news and stuff. And so support for the war evaporated. And so a little bit about Agent Orange. Many of my classmates who were there are suffering still from Agent. I talked to one this morning, a guy that lives in South Carolina, Travelers Rest, South Carolina. He lives in the woods. He has bears on his porch almost every morning. He's suffering from it's not Alzheimer's, it's Parkinson's.
Yeah, I know several.
Yeah, a lot of them have Parkinson's and also the cancer, prostate cancer. Known to be caused, and you can imagine how many Vietnamese are also suffering from this. But the reason they did this is you go up the river to go up to Saigon. It's considerably inland to go up a long river to get there. At that time, there was jungle on the north side, totally controlled by the Viet Cong. And so someone came with the bright idea, well, we'll make it safe for the ships to go up there. Just cargo ships and military ships to go up there by getting rid of all where they can hide. And so there it is, spraying that stuff, and that's what it looks like. In my book, one of my classmates said when he went up the river, it had lush green over on the south side of the river. He said the north side looked like the moon. Just terrible. If you hear I Corps, that's the part up north called, these were not U.S. military things. These were administrative regions set up by the South Vietnamese government. But 1, 2, 3, and 4 Corps. And they also had an administrative area around Saigon. But, so if someone says, hey, I fought in 2 Corps, I fought in I Corps, most of the Marines are up in I Corps. A lot of the Army guys are in 2 and 3 Corps. The Navy mostly, it was down in 4 Corps, although there was a lot of Army down there. In the book you read, several of my classmates were in these monitors, like out of Civil War, where a very low-lying boat that would carry a whole group of Army personnel in it, troops, they'd take them up these rivers and canals and drop them off. Then they'd sweep to another canal, and we'd come around and pick them up. And incredible ambushes, things. And we set up ambushes, they set up ambushes. It was, once again, not a lot of rules. Say brown water Navy, because you hear that term, the rivers there are just totally muddy and everything, and that's why it's called brown water. Whereas all the other Navy guys out at sea were in blue water. That's where the carriers were. Yes.
My doctor at the VA asked me each time I go, excuse me, was I subjected to Agent Orange? I was on the ground for a year. But I can't honestly say I was subjected to Agent Orange. So I can't, I don't wanna say I was and I wasn't, or,
Well, basically, by being in country, if you want any benefits associated with Agent Orange, you can get it. It's just assumed, presumed.
and that's
So-
why he keeps asking
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
And I tell him no, but someone says, well, you need to be getting these benefits,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking, why? Someone
Well,
else needs them more than I
Once
do.
again, yeah, of course. I'm just saying that even some of the people offshore, because what happens is there's 19 million gallons of this stuff dumped that we know of, and a lot of it went into the water, went into the oceans, and then the ships would take that water in, and it'd be floating around all over your ship.
So,
So anyway, but and some of those you can see. I think this is. Did you say Guiana?
yeah, I saw it once
Right
you
there,
did that,
right there.
right.
There's the
yeah,
dot. You were correct.
Right, yeah.
A lot of very famous battles taking place here.
Mm,
There's way up there. Tremendous fights along here because they could just use their artillery in the north to do it. One of the stories in the book involves a guy who was a Marine, went back for a second tour, and he actually worked for the CIA. He was an assassin. They would go into the villages and find out who the, quote, tax collectors were, and then go back at night and slit their throat. He also was actually up in North Vietnam with a group of South Vietnamese commandos. They would go up in rubber boats at night, go ashore. He actually wore Viet Cong black pajamas and up there. So, I mean, once again, there aren't a lot of rules. So that just tells you a little bit about the different things. Even the Coast Guard was involved. I had no idea until I started doing this. But they were mostly down the Gulf of Thailand. One of the phrases you hear is market time operations. Market time simply referred to the U.S. Navy's attempt to interdict boats coming down the coast, and some coming in from Cambodia too. But so the Coast Guard was out looking at, and this is all very subjective. And by that I mean, you see some fishermen in a small boat going. Well, sometimes we just blew them away. Terrible. Other times, more responsible people, they would go up and go alongside, check the boat didn't have any contraband, and let these people try to make a living and survive. But I'm just saying, terrible things happen. I'm not going to dwell on this. These are just some almost stock pictures, but just showing you just how terrible it can be. When Nixon was elected, you can say what you want about him, but he did start withdrawing forces. And as I said, that's when our casualties started to come down. We would not sign this peace treaty, and the Vietnamese wouldn't sign the peace treaty until we each had a guarantee. One, that our POWs would all be released, and two, that we would take all the mines out of Haiphong Harbor. One of the stories in the book involved a couple of my classmates that were CO captains of minesweepers that were up. That was their duty, to try to clear the mines out of the harbor. And as soon as, this is another one, as soon as this, quote, peace treaty was signed, neither side, once again, between the North and South, had any intention whatsoever of this peace treaty actually working. It was mostly between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese. We get our guys back, we'll get rid of that, we'll leave you guys alone. However, we had people die all the way up through 75 over there, because once again, we had a bunch of advisors. And when Saigon fell in 75, actually hit guys out on some of the helicopter carriers where they're shoving helicopters over the side so that people could land on the ship. Some conclusions. That's the book itself. I want to show you some of my classmates. These are the 9 guys that died. And some of the aviators got shot down, but it's war. And when you take off of a carrier, if you get what's called a cold cat, you'll die. A cold cat, the way you get on a jet airplane to be launched off a carrier is they have a steam catapult that basically slings you off the carrier. If it doesn't have the correct amount of steam or there's some malfunction that takes place, you don't get slung off, and your jet engines aren't enough, and the carrier runs over the top of you. And had that happen to some people. And then one of the guys they interviewed, his plane, it developed a problem, and he bailed out, fortunately, over the South China Sea, and was picked up. There were sharks circling when he got picked up, but he didn't get picked up. There were some more naval aviators. I knew almost all these guys, and these are the Marines that died. Mike Grammer, terrible. He was captured and tortured and then killed. We finally got his remains back, I think, in 2002. Anyway, that's the presentation, but I want to say a couple things about it. Was sort of our hubris or arrogance that caused us to think that we could do this war. We had beaten the Germans and the Japanese without any problems, quote unquote. Had managed to beat them in World War II. Korea we thought was an aberration. That it was only because the Chinese communists came in that otherwise we could have won that. And anyway, we ended up with a stable, quote unquote, South Korea. So we thought we could achieve something similar there, and had not learned and not studied Ho Chi Minh. One of his quotes was, he had a lot of famous quotes. And one of them was, okay, you can kill 1,000 of our people, and I can only kill 100 of yours. We'll still win. So, I mean, we didn't understand, didn't study his things. And as I said, this is not a stupid guy. He didn't run the war. He had this guy, Giap, who was general who was running the war. He was the philosophical leader of the country, you might say, that sort of thing. So I feel that it was a series of missed opportunities that we had when we could have sided with the Vietnamese. We're doing trading partners with them now and everything. And like I said, I travel there, and so who knows what would have happened.
I think Nixon, ironically, because in the 50s he was very much containment theory.
Yes.
He was one of the biggest proponents of all the things you just talked about. But he was the one that in the 70s realized the difference between Russian communism and Asian communism. And he opened up diplomatic relations with China, and he ended the Vietnamese War. Because Castro, Ho Chi Minh, to a lesser extent Mao, had all reached out to the United States before they...
Yeah, before things happened.
And because of our engagement with France and with Chiang Kai-shek and even Kim Il-sung in Korea was a hardcore Russian communist. I mean, he was trained in Russia, fought with Russia in World War II. But a lot of the other ones, even Castro they had all reached out to the United States to try to embrace, and Castro loved the U.S., but it was really like the U.S.'s previous relations with other countries that drew them further and further into these wars.
What, with respect to France, one of the things that pushed us towards supporting them was de Gaulle and our wanting him to become a really integral part of our defense against the Soviet Union. And that was weighed and deemed to be more important than some little pissant country, so to speak, over on the other side of the world at the time.
Well, we did the same thing in Iran, too, where we put the king who hadn't been king for the Shah back in power in place of a really, really popular president who actually had been in the United States a few years before we helped depose him. So all of our Asian policy at this time was
Well, we all have the
it was, it was
benefit.
really unfortunate.
We got
that-
the benefit of hindsight now,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
But having said that, though,
Mm.
you almost want to think back and say, what if?
I have a question.
Yes,
for you.
ma'am.
Okay, I think it's the Smithsonian is doing an oral history project with World War II veterans. Because I had a friend that they were going to interview, but unfortunately he passed away before they did it. Because where I lived in Pennsylvania, the local group that did the Quilts of Valor had given his name to him. That's what really intrigued me and wanted me to read your book, because I had heard his stories about World War II for
Right.
years. Have they done anything like that with Vietnam?
I don't know,
veterans?
but I'm going back to Virginia Saturday is when we leave.
Okay,
And when I'm back there, I want to approach several different organizations to see, because I really want to capture this oral history.
right,
And for me, it was an eye-opener, and I think that we need to talk to people before they all die.
right. and
We
I-
had 800 people in our class, and roughly 520 are alive tonight. Some, though, not in good health.
Right,
And so, but they all have interesting stories. I mean, in my case, I could write about submarine experiences. I choose not to. But I could write about what was really going on there and between the Soviet Union and the United States. But I'm definitely going to be checking into that.
because I thought it was a fantastic idea, because there's very few World War II vets still around, and I mean,
Well,
he told me a lot of stories.
there's an outfit called the Naval Institute, which is essentially a nonprofit historical side of the Navy. It's not really direct, it doesn't get money from the Navy, or anything, and they publish a lot of books. I chose not to try to approach them because I had two bad experiences with publishers. But I am going to go to them and offer up my primary sources, that I have all these interviews that are on cassette tapes, and whatever they want to do with them, and because I think it is important. The Naval Academy has 10 copies of my book down there now. So we'll see. I want to thank you guys for coming out here. I'm still